Um, I'll get right to it. I'm going to share this graph just to give you a sense of what it is that I'm going to present. Essentially, what this graph depicts is Italian trade compared to trade with the rest of the industrially developed world, which essentially means Western Europe, North America, US, Canada, and Japan. Now, so that would be the line underneath the Italian line. And it's important to note that, this was the fastest growing trade at the time. Although it seems like it's not growing very fast, that's just as a consequence of having Italy in there. Trade with Italy takes off right away from the mid-50s, which is pretty much when all trade began to happen with the West for the Soviets. And then importantly, and that's sort of what I'm going to explain, it kind of stagnates from 1962 till about 1966. It just kind of stays more or less at the same level, right? And then it takes off again faster than ever. And that's sort of what I want to explain here. Most of this presentation takes from the documents from the Ministry of Foreign Trade, and so it may sort of set the it may set the context of this conference by sort of zooming out and talking about the place of the Soviet Union in the wider changes that are ongoing in Western Europe, rather than looking sort of more at the minutiae of Soviet foreign trade. It's going to place Soviet foreign trade within this kind of broad canvas of world economic changes. Importantly, the text begins, I go back a little bit to the beginning anyway, so just to give a little contextual information about Soviet-Italian trade. I think Soviet-Italian trade is special, particularly important for the reasons that I'm going to present now. So if you'll allow me, I'm gonna have to read because I'm a terrible speaker, it turns out. And so here it goes. In 1964, trade with Italy had stagnated. Khrushchev's economic crisis had dampened Soviet export capacity, and the later crisis in agriculture, in Soviet agriculture, had deviated many purchases away from industrial goods in Europe and toward the purchase of grain, much of it in the Americas. So a lot of that stagnation has to do with the fact that all of a sudden the Soviets are having to import and to use all their reserves to import all this grain, mainly from Canada, some from Australia, and the United States. Nikita Pivovarov has written the article on this. In Italy, this was felt as a blip in a relationship that had always been special to both Soviets and Italians. More than any other relationship, this one embodied what the Soviets repeated ad nauseum about trade thriving on relations both parties found profitable. Italy had consistently served the Soviets to break Western European taboos about what could and could not be traded with the East. And Italy had used the Soviet Union to undermine established monopolies, especially in energy, and to outflank more competitive companies elsewhere in Europe. Italy, in other words, had made the most of the Bretton Woods segmentation of European economic life, and its government and business community had done surpassingly well in coordinating and administering economic relations with the East. This context of the Bretton Woods is important, and I'm not going to have time to really sort of tease it out, but I feel like anyway, this audience knows quite well the kind of the structure of the world economy at this time, right? It's structured very differently from how it is today. It is, I call it segmented because there's all kinds of barriers to money flows and to trade, right? In order to trade or to finance some trade or anything, to do anything at all internationally, you have to go to your own government and ask for permission. And how that changes is what I'm going to be talking about here as well. So the Italians had established a clearing payments mechanism for barter trade as early as 1948 and regularized annual trade with the Soviets through trade lists in 1952. It is only a slight overestimation to say that the Soviets had learned to trade in the new Cold War world with the Italians. Learned, that is, to circumvent the structural power of US dollar exclusion. The Soviets found it very difficult to trade with anybody. Everybody found it difficult to trade at that time for lack of dollars, right? And the Italians were really some of the first to offer them opportunities to trade on barter terms, etc. And then to develop things like trade lists through which they could balance their trade more easily. So these were technologies for increasing trade easily. The Soviets learned to do that in part with the Italians. By the end of the 1950s, this form of barter exchange with the Italians yielded another innovation: large-scale importation of Soviet oil through a pipes for oil deal. In an ominous turn, half of exports to Italy in 1962 were oil, much of the rest coal and timber. This had the effect of putting the Italian state energy conglomerate, Ente Nazionale Idrocarburi, ENI, on the map internationally. ENI's head, Enrico Mattei, had long sought to bypass the transnational monopoly power of the so-called Seven Sisters, the 7 US and UK oil companies that controlled international pricing. Their loss of control would in time, the loss of the Seven Sisters to control pricing would in time occasion the biggest crisis of the post-war era. Some of the first steps to the oil crisis of 1973 were taken by Mattei hand in hand with the Soviets. Although it is often said that the Soviets were driven to export only so that they may import deficit goods, the relationship with Italy clearly showed the opposite. Breakthroughs in energy exports were driving imports of all sorts of Italian industrial goods. Especially expedient were the imports of machinery and equipment at a moment when Khrushchev was driving the chemicalization of the Soviet economy. I think everybody here knows that, meaning mainly the development of fertilizers and synthetic materials through new uses of hydrocarbons. The Italian relationship then was, in various important ways, the formative arena within which the Soviets nurtured their eventual relationship with the rest of Western Europe. They leaned on their energy reserves, exchanging it for technology that aimed to resolve myriad social problems of Soviet economic life and aspirations, especially in food and consumer goods, as well, and well before the United States became anxious in the 1960s and through the 70s about Western Europe's dependency on communist energy. Italy had become the first Western European country to allow the Soviets a significant weight in their energy balance, up to 14% by 1965 of the energy consumed came from the Soviet Union, the energy consumed in Italy. These pioneering interactions in energy between the two polities could not have happened without bold advances in Italy's financial offers to the Soviets. As early as 1957, the Italians had made the switch away from clearing exchanges and toward lira-based exchanges, 1 year before the lira became fully convertible. The 4-year trade agreement they negotiated at the same time, covering 1958 to 1961, aimed to double their bilateral trade turnover. It tripled instead. The Italian business community nurtured the relationship as assiduously as its state, if at times a bit more disingenuously. In the midst of this blip, for example, in Italy's economic miracle in the summer of 1964, it's part also of the reason why that trade stagnates around this time. Italy has been growing tremendously since the post-war, throughout the post-war period, almost 2 decades now. And in 63, 64, they kind of hit a wall. They overcome it until the 1970s when they really stagnate. In the midst of this split, an important delegation of Italian businessmen, including 55 company bosses, visited Moscow in the summer of 1964. They were met by Kosygin and Patolichev, but it was their more prosaic meetings with the heads of the Soviet foreign trade organizations that the Italian delegation's leaders raised eyebrows when he expressed confidence that the Soviet Union would defeat, quote, the US in peaceful economic competition. Italian industry is ready to help the Soviet Union in that competition, he said. Italian solicitousness paid off toward the end of the decade with a surge of exports of the wide diameter pipe that would soon knit Europe back together again. The technopolitical process owed much to the Italian state's willingness to coordinate the country's resources in order to prod at the political and economic boundaries of the Bretton Woods settlement. I'll explain what I mean in a second about that. It was predictably the embodiment of Italian political economy under Bretton Woods, the state-owned petrochemical conglomerate ENI, that simultaneously exemplified and propelled the relationship with the Soviet Union. It innovated for the West the 5-year-long agreements that would govern Soviet capitalist relations over the next 2 decades. It first signed a 1960 to 65 barter agreement for 12 tons of oil in exchange for pipe, equipment, and synthetic rubber. This is at a time when countries are doing 3-year agreements, Western countries are. In 1963, it signed yet another 5-year agreement covering 1965 to 1970 for 25 million tons of oil. This last one was negotiated in parallel with state-to-state negotiations over a substantial expansion of trade, as well as its extension covering the next Soviet 5-year plan to the end of the 1960s. Both were signed concurrently. Both ENI and Italy as a state signed their agreements in November 1963. Before machinery contracts, before negotiations over timber, oil rendered material a prospective relationship that both sides continued to underestimate. This material flow of oil, the physical substantiation of political decisions yet to cohere, also galvanized new and longer-term financial flows, credits to finance rather undetermined machinery exports to the Soviet Union to pay for the energy. In other words, they settled on the energy before they even worked out what it is that the Soviets wanted from Italy. They took longer, this list took longer to put together, and this finance took longer to put together, though Italian bankers never seemed to doubt they would be proffered, they would be offered. The problem, a managing director from Banco di Roma explained, was the economic crisis in Italy, which not only weakened Italy's reserves, but was also characterized by high inflation after a decade of economic growth, as miraculous as the more celebrated ones in Germany and Japan. The Bank of Italy implemented financial repression measures to lower debt levels to foreign banks and grow currency reserves. In other words, the large long-term loan that had been the subject of so much speculation for over a year had to wait for liquidity to return to the Italian financial system. As the situation turned by the last quarter of 1964, the Soviets began to ratchet up the pressure, announcing the preparation of large orders in Italy over the next 5-year plan if only the Italians would create the right financial conditions. This is a motto the Soviets are constantly using. If you give us the right financial conditions, we will buy from you, etc., etc. The agreement finally came in February 1965, somewhat below expectations. Nevertheless, it allowed Italians not only to balance the suddenly growing imports of oil, but also to create the surplus they had long sought, as the Italians binged on Italian industrial goods. Their trade agreement for the latter half of the 1960s had expected an impressive 50% increase in trade turnover over 5 years. It doubled instead. These then were the kind of the sorties against the energetic and financial environment that had made Bretton Woods possible, and which the very stability of Bretton Woods itself would undermine. In June 1965, the final prolonged assault would commence. That was the month in which the insurrectionary Italians made two proposals that would evolve into two of the largest transnational European projects of the 1960s. One is likely the most famous East-West cooperative endeavor, but the other one is certainly the most important. By this, I refer, of course, to Fiat and the oil for pipes. Fiat's president made his initial pitch for a factory in the Soviet Union on June 28, 1965, 11 days after Eni had made a rather more ambitious pitch, a gas pipe to puncture the Iron Curtain. Both would require large outlays of credit, but the pipeline alone would anchor a pioneering practice in East-West relations. The proposal was new enough that the Soviets found themselves a bit confused. They hadn't done this before, they told Eni, and any pipe would have to go through Hungary, Austria, and Yugoslavia, they said, countries that would demand some of the gas flowing through them. Who would pay for all this? Eni offered to lay the pipe, and the Soviets could pay back in gas deliveries. This is the kind of the innovation. To belabor the point, the Fiat project proved to be the crowning achievement of a world that would soon move on. The deal took less than a year to come together, which would prove to be rather fast compared to the original energy deal Eni proposed that June. That deal took 4 years to put together for the Italians. This was still longer than usual, but not by much, as the Fiat contract was not qualitatively different from any number of turnkey deals the Soviets had negotiated over the previous decade or so. Industrialists had put together a one-time project requiring the erection of a particular financial scaffolding because it was so large, but nothing that they hadn't done before. It is important that the financial scaffolding remain particular and did not become a model of future business practices. When finance finally became free in the 1970s, it did not do so through discrete transnational deals between national banks, as with the deal with Fiat. It did so on the basis of a global reordering of energy, its flows, its sources, its materiality, and socio-political consequences. And part of that groundwork was laid by Eni. Eni had gotten to Moscow only a week before Fiat on that fateful June month of 1965, but the company had been building trust with the Soviets for 7 years by then. And through the kind of long-term plannable exchange practices the Soviets had long desired from the West, those 5-year programs, those 5-year plans that they worked out that I spoke about earlier. The commodity exchange, oil, also helped the cause, as did the vast transformations then occurring in the energetic base of European prosperity, as it changed from dirty and socially unruly coal to more socially manageable, more calorific petroleum. This historic change, which Timothy Mitchell has convincingly argued helped assemble neoliberal governance from the 1970s and to the detriment of Europe's labor unions and worker interests. This switch from coal to oil, I'm not going to rehearse Timothy Mitchell's famous argument here, but that switch in the energy regime that he says sort of helped produce neoliberalism. That was in large part produced with the enthusiastic cooperation of the Soviet Union. But it was first spearheaded in Europe by the United States and its Marshall Plan. This plan is usually thought of as eclectic in infrastructure and the infrastructure it financed. But in fact, the Marshall Plan, the oil from American companies was the single largest expense the plan financed. It was 10% of the total. Besides this explicit subsidy to the oil majors, essentially, they lent money to European companies and countries, and that money then went right back to American oil companies. That was 10% of that was what the Marshall Plan was. Besides this explicit subsidy to the oil majors, much of the rest concerned the infrastructure necessary for the production and consumption of petroleum energy, oil refineries. This is other stuff that the Marshall Plan went to finance: aircraft, roads, tractors, and vehicles of all sorts, which Europeans at times, of course, resisted, famously, for example, when France built a whole train infrastructure that then it linked up to atomic energy rather than oil. But it was this market position in energy that the Marshall Plan built for US companies in Europe that ENI wanted precisely to destabilize. The Italian ENI wanted to destabilize US oil monopolies in Europe. As ENI's representative in Moscow, Pasquale Landolfi, explained to the Soviets, what ENI wanted from its deal with the Soviets was to escape the necessity of extending yet another contract for gas to Esso, which is today Exxon, with which they had recently signed a contract for the Americans to bring 10 billion cubic meters of gas from Libya every year. As the switch out of coal the Americans had initiated in the 1940s continued apace, ENI found it would need to add another 6 billion cubic meters of gas to the energy hold from abroad. But the Soviets took this proposal from the Italians, from ENI, from June 1965, and quickly maximized it. They maximized their counter-proposal, proposing that they may import gas pipe equipment deliveries large enough in order to prepare for the export of 20 BCM, 20 billion cubic meters of gas a year to Italy. ENI balked for two reasons. Italian industry, like Nofi said, could not produce that much equipment. And more importantly for the Italian government, the bigger pipe project, the greater the repayment period would be. So the Italians thought, well, if you buy all this, if we buy all this oil from you, first of all, we cannot produce the pipelines. And second of all, the repayment period would be very long. But this is important because this is exactly what the Soviets want. They proposed instead to help build an export capacity of 10 BCM, so half the Soviet proposal, 6 of which would go to Italy, and the remaining 4 would be sold in the countries through which the gas flowed. At this point, which is February 1966, the negotiations have been ongoing, the Italians were envisioning yet another modest push on the financial boundaries of the era. If they signed the deal in 1966, the Italians would take 2 years to deliver and lay the pipe and equipment. The cost would be repaid in gas over the next 7 years. The credit, in other words, would be for 9 years, which would be only half a year longer than Fiat's arrangement with the financing for Fiat's factory. The two partners, and this is my point, were envisioning this quite differently. ENI had in mind an already enormous project that would strain its financial and productive capacity to the limit. It wanted to bring in gas in from Ukraine. ENI thought that it would get the gas that was already being produced in Ukraine and through Hungary and Yugoslavia. But the Soviets had altogether something else in mind. They would use this opportunity to get the Italians to fund the connection of the West Siberian gas fields to the gas pipe network of European Russia and Eastern Europe. Complementarily, they wanted to use the occasion to mark a new financial precedent that they could use elsewhere as they continued creating a market for subsidized capital for themselves in the industrially advanced world. This is something they would always do. They would go to a country and say, hey, give me finance for 8 years. They would say, well, why? We've been giving you for 5 years. Why should we give you 8 years? Well, because Italy's giving it to us for 8 years, so you better too, otherwise we won't buy from you. So they were constantly sort of pushing that boundary. And that's what I mean by sort of breaking down Bretton Woods, right? Because under Bretton Woods, you cannot lend money for very long. You cannot lend very much money. Despite the delays in the gas deal, the fact was that by the mid-decade, stagnation in Soviet-Italian trade came to an end in 1966. So they didn't quite reach the gas deal in 1966. And that has a kind of different history that I'm not going to get into here. But they broke the impasse, then they broke the kind of stagnation that they had suffered since 1963, 64. And they did so on the old standby oil for industrial goods, rather than gas for pipes. The engine behind the breakthrough was finance, a new level in the volume of Soviet oil exports, the prospect of a secure infrastructural relationship, and a large fiat deal all contributed to loosening the financial flows eastward. with the debt closing already on the $1 billion mark. Oil broke the impasse. The finance finally turned Italian trade deficits into trade surpluses at the end of the 1960s, and all the while, the gas deal languished. It was never finished until the end of 1969. Patrolchev had been around long enough to know why. Italy and the Soviet Union had even recently had no problem arranging for immense deals like the Fiat factory and assorted oil deals with ENI. A pipeline connection was a very different kind of bond, though, and new to the Soviet Union. They were not going to get this wrong. ENI, meanwhile, took its time. By 1969, managers were aware that they had lost the initiative to the Germans and the Austrians, but expected the Soviets would keep their offer standing. So I'm kind of rushing through. This is actually part of a chapter in the book I'm writing, and I'm kind of rushing through. There's all these negotiations that they sort of get stuck. Mainly they get stuck because the Italians are asking for too low a price for gas. So the Soviets turn around and start negotiating with the Austrians, because the Austrians had heard that the Soviets were negotiating with Italy, and they arranged for a price that's much higher than the one that the Soviets were offering the Italians. And so the Soviets had no reason to lower their price. And the Italians, for one reason or another, were not increasing their offered price. And so the deal languished. However, just to cut it short, after they saw that the Soviets had signed the deal with Austria, and especially after they realized that they had signed the deal also by the summer of 1969 with Germany, all of a sudden the Italians were very quick to accept Soviet prices of the price that the Soviet Union offered. At a substantial meeting in November in Florence, would quickly produce the results that could have been reached more than 2 years earlier, and would have made Italy and ENI the main hub and partner for the supply of red gas in Western Europe. The Soviets felt vindicated by the fact that the price of gas had not fallen, as the Italians kept saying it would. Generally speaking, and that they had been right in 1968 when Chelyabinsk had suddenly decided to lower his price offer. In fact, the prices they negotiated with Austria and Germany was a further vindication, but it was the forcible integration of European gas purchases as mediated and centralized in Moscow that gave this for position. And I'm almost over, if you bear with me just a little bit. Here's a long quote from one of the documents. In December 1969 compared to April 1968, the situation has changed to the advantage of the Soviet side. I think Osipov, or one of them, told his Italian negotiating partner in 1969. In April 1968, ENI was the only major consumer of Soviet gas, and today, Osipov goes on to say, today Soviet gas has already been sold to 2 countries, even as active negotiations are being carried out with a third one. By this he means France. That is, if then ENI had some right to tell Sanchez-Sibony about the need to pay for entry into the market, they now have lost that right. I mentioned that because I cut off some stuff from that quote, but the point of that quote is market talk that the Soviets really learned how to do over time. And the use of market logic, that's an important component of what I'm talking about, because the market is the thing that's going to break out, that's going to break apart the kind of the power that Western countries have when they come to trade with the Soviet Union. That's what markets do, right? They decentralize. And the problem with the world economy is that power is centralized, especially in the United States. So the Soviets become very adept at talking about the market, of using kind of market logic, market discourse to move deals forward and overcome a kind of Cold War barrier to the kind of trade that they want to actually carry out. Market logic steal the Soviets. And then I say something silly where I imitate the Bible, and I say that on the seventh day, because on the seventh day of that negotiating round, they finally reached the deal, and that's the end of that. So I don't know if that was very coherent. It's more coherent in a longer test, but essentially I want to sort of argue that oil requires a different kind of finance, and it's in building this infrastructure that has the Soviet Union at its center that Europe realizes that they need to begin changing the infrastructure of finance, that Bretton Woods is not allowing them to build the kind of energetic infrastructure that they need to continue their change from coal to gas and oil. So I'm trying to place the Soviet Union kind of at the center of these changes in finance and energy that occurred in the 1970s. That's all.